price controls, part of our lecture series on government intervention. I start this lecture with a quote from economist Hugh Rockoff, who paraphrases the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman when he says that economists may not know much, but they do know how to produce a shortage or a surplus. In this video, we're going to discuss how government intervention in the market ruins everything. This is sarcastic. And we're going to also illustrate how this happens with price floors and price ceilings. The market, when you think about what we know about the market and equilibrium, the market of perfect competition, it takes three forces for the market of perfect competition to function in the way that we've laid out so far in this class. The first are consumers with demands. The second is profit maximizing firms. And the third is that the equilibria in this market are, and the third is self-reinforcing equilibria. Once a market achieves equilibrium, we believe it will stay in equilibrium. So those things make the market go. If we obstruct any of these, the market will not function as effectively. And when we say as effectively, we mean in the sense that the market will achieve that equilibrium point that maximizes the economic surplus of the actors inside the market. The price in a market of perfect competition adjusts automatically through a process that we as economists don't precisely understand. Some people call this the invisible hand of the market. Whatever you like to call it, in a market of perfect competition, there's no one that sets the price just occurs due to the interactions of buyers and sellers. So if we interfere with this price setting mechanism in a market of perfect competition, this can lead to what we call a market failure. And a market failure is any market that does not allocate resources efficiently for society. Now, we haven't really talked about what efficiency means in terms of a market, but for now we can go with the definition that if the market is at equilibrium, it's actually maximizing the economic surplus of the actors in the market, something we'll talk about probably next week. And so an efficient market is one where the market is at equilibrium. Now, if you're a government policymaker, you might believe that setting the price of a good might be just sort of the easiest thing to do. Why worry about more complicated policy interventions when you can just pass a law that bread costs $1 or that milk costs $3? In other words, you can just directly intervene in the market, but this is going to lead to market distortions and market failures if these constraints are binding. And let me show what I mean by binding. Binding constraints are those that operate to hinder someone or hinder the market. In other words, if the US legislature passed a law that said coffee can't cost more than $500 per cup, would that currently have any effect? The answer is no. That constraint is not binding because no one's selling coffee for $500 a cup as far as I know. But if the law said cups of coffee can't cost more than $2, that would be binding. That's a binding constraint because there's lots of people who are selling coffee for more than $2 a cup. Or, if the notion of $500 changed somehow, that constraint could also become binding. If you're taking Econ 2A, we'll talk more about how inflation might cause that later on in the semester. So here's a non-binding price ceiling. If the legislature passes a law that says the price can't go any higher than this, in this market, you can see that the equilibrium point is not above the ceiling. It is below the ceiling. So if the equilibrium point is below the ceiling, this constraint is not binding. The market can still function relatively efficiently because we've gotten to the equilibrium point. However, if the ceiling is below the equilibrium price, this is a binding price ceiling. And the price cannot go any greater than the line that says ceiling there. And as you know, what that means is at this price, there will be relatively little supply and a lot of demand, which will make this a shortage in this market. And so if we have a binding price ceiling, that's going to lead to a shortage in the market because this is the excess demand that demanders would want at this price point. When the government tries to set a maximum rent for a class of apartments or for all apartments or for any class of housing, that's going to create a shortage in the market for those apartments. Also, anti-price gouging laws. If the government passes a law that says that prices can only rise at a certain percentage, that's going to create shortages. We saw that in part from some of the things that happened during our COVID-19 outbreak in March of 2020. Finally, college. We can think about college as an example of something that has a price ceiling, in that there are a limited number of seats for everyone that wants to go to school. In the market, if there's a shortage, and this ties into the disequilibrium we talked about a couple weeks ago, we end up with rationing. Either rationing by weighting, or by firms just picking the customers they want to do business with, or by more government regulation. The picture I have here is from Duke University, and it's what's called Krzyzewskiville. This is students camping out for tickets to the Duke basketball games. They do this for weeks and weeks. There are now more regulations about how many people can camp out, how often they have to be there because they should be going to class, what kind of appliances are allowed, what kind of appliances are not allowed. Basically, the government of Duke has gone in and tightly regulated this kind of rationing to ensure sort of safety and fairness and things like that. You can imagine another situation where the Duke administration prices tickets, in line with the demand, and would obviate the need for this kind of camping out. What about the opposite of a price ceiling? A price floor. Again, we have our binding price floor here on our graphic, and if the price is relatively high, then demand is relatively low and supply is relatively high. So we have an excess supply when there's a price floor. Some examples of price floors include agriculture, where the US government has built in a series of price supports and other subsidies for farmers to make sure that crop prices stay high enough that production can continue, and the minimum wage. And some people believe that if the minimum wage is raised to be high enough, some companies will not want to hire as many people because the people are more expensive to hire. So these are just a couple examples of price floors. Now, we have shown you this pretty model, and now we're talking about how the government can interfere and mess with the pretty model that we have. And, we have to think about, what is the government doing this for? Why is the government doing this to markets? Pretty much everyone, even the most laissez-faire or let the market roll kind of person, would believe the government is necessary to enforce contracts and to require transparency in markets. Now, some other people might believe that the government should provide goods that the market either won't, or that society doesn't believe should be allocated via a market. And a smaller group of people believe that the government should interfere in markets in order to enforce equity in the market. So these are just some of the reasons why governments might take a role in markets, to not just let the market itself decide how to allocate resources. I mentioned Hugh Rockoff at the start of this lecture, and this is a website where he writes a whole article about price controls that I recommend you read if you're interested in more information about how price controls have happened through history and what their effects have been. So, if a market can't get to the equilibrium point, that's one example of a market failure. An easy way to produce a market failure is by setting the price externally, like the government sets the price externally. If price floors and ceilings are binding, they would create market failures. And a hint of the next lecture here, quotas or quantity restrictions could also accomplish the same market failure. So thank you.